Sharpening for better performance. Life on the edge. The turning guru's quip. To compensate for dull tools, use bad techniques. There are many methods to sharpen. Everybody has their preferred system. All these systems do the job. If you look right over there, you'll see that there are 3 systems there and there's 1 here. We have 4 different systems here that we will be talking about from time to time. Whatever works for you or it works for me is a standard phrase. If we look in the mirror, we see a human being who likes to be right. And people do not want to change. The only thing in this world that is constant is change. We do not need to change, but we all need to embrace new technology. Frequently asked question. What bevel angle do you use? That's a frequently asked question. How important is that? How do you position the tool rest? Where do you set it? Do you set it on center? What do you do with that? What grit or what do you sharpen with? When do you know it's time to resharpen? That one came up, and that's not really a frequently asked question. And the obvious smart aleck answer is when your tool's dull. But how do you know your tool's sharp? If you don't know what a sharp tool is, knowing when you need to resharpen is not a good thing. But you do know what it's like to cut with a sharp tool, and you go over and you sharpen your tool and it comes back and still doesn't cut right. What do? Sharpen it again. Why do I need CBN wheels? All right, here's what bevel angle do you use and why? Generally, it's 40 degrees for spindles and 60 degrees for bowls. In the club system, we have a varigrind, and we have this little wheel, this little block here that George has so wonderfully brought to the club quite a few years ago. Yeah, come to open shop, we'll even not only give you one of these, but we'll show you how to use it. I'm giving you this, but the piece of wood, okay? All right. So this sets you up with what we call the club grind, but it's also called the Ellsworth grind. David Ellsworth was a guy that pretty much invented this grind. And it gives you lots of options and stuff, and it's a really, really good starting place in your sharpening. Generally 40 degrees for a spindle gouge and 60 degrees for a bowl gouge, and this will do both of them. Handle position is what is mostly affected by bevel angle. If you're doing a spindle in your 60 degrees, you'll start the bead over here and you'll end up over here. At 40 degrees, you start a little straighter and you end up a little bit less further around. It's because of the point on it. How it cuts, nothing to do with anything. They both cut the same. 60 degree tends to be the English grind, the club grind, Ellsworth grind, they're basically the same thing, and the Irish grind. That's another one was real out there. Bottom of the bowl gouge, if you have one of those, is usually from 60 to 80 degrees, depending on how flat you need the bottom of that bowl. If you're making a dog bowl, then you need it pretty flat, so you have to have a steeper angle to get the tool down inside the bowl. The Michelson grind is whatever you desire, but it's usually 55 degrees. That's pretty much the standard for it, but you can do it with a 40 degree angle, you can do it with a 60 degree, whatever you want to do. The Stuart Batty has a 40-40 grind. The bevel, no matter what you grind, the bevel needs to be consistent and continuous. That means it doesn't have facets in it. It doesn't have valleys in the edge. It doesn't have look like a 40-carat diamond on the outside of there where it needs to be smooth. It needs to be pretty. It needs to be nice. Most swept back grinds, the bevel angle changes between the nose and the wing. Bowl gouge, Ellsworth bowl gouge starts out at 60 degrees. As you swing around and start sharpening the wings, it comes back almost to about 30-35 degrees on the very back of the wing. So that bevel is, if you're swinging the bowl gouge and not paying attention, you can get to a point and it can give you a really nasty catch if you're not paying attention to it. So which bevel angle is more aggressive? 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and why? Is a 40-degree bevel more aggressive than a 60? It's not. It can be presented in such a way that it's grabby, but if it's presented properly, it really doesn't matter what the bevel angle is, except for handle position. I was once asked, where do you start? Position your tool rest, where do you start? Okay, a good place to start is putting where the tool is laying on the tool rest and it's even with the center, one of your centers, either your tailstock or your live center. That's a starting spot. You position the tool rest where you're comfortable when you're turning, okay? This thing is round. I can point that gouge at the center way down here or way up here. And wherever I'm comfortable is where I want to put that tool rest, okay? Different tools and different bevel angles may require different tool rest settings. And different tools, if you have a 3/8 bowl gouge compared to a 1-inch bowl gouge or a 3/4 inch bowl gouge, you may have to adjust your tool rest to get that tip where you need it to make a nice cut. The tool rest should be constantly adjusted to keep it as close to the turning as practical. Beginners, shut the lathe off before you adjust the tool rest. When you adjust the tool rest, learn from the beginning to not stick your hand down in here between the work and the tool rest when you adjust it, whether the lathe is running or not. We adjust the tool rest down here where we can move it back and forth, and we're not going to get it into anything. If your tool rest does not slide easily on your ways, fix that before you go to adjusting it. So that's where you'll get in trouble. Sometimes instead of saying, don't do this and don't do that, it's learn how to do it. And then you can save yourself a lot of heartache and a lot of trouble and save the switches on your lathe and everything else, okay? But that's not the main important thing. The main important thing is to move the tool rest in such a way that we don't hurt ourselves. All right, some of this comes from different people, and he said, I had a slow-speed Ricon grinder, 2 stone wheels, 60 grit and 120 grit, a one-way Wolverine system, a Varigrind, 1 diamond grinding wheel dresser, on and on. The problem was my tools were still dull. Until I realized Sharp was testing the edge, so I realized what Sharp was. Definition of Sharp. To understand sharpness, we must first understand the definition of an edge. We're not talking about the bevel here, we're talking about the edge. The edge is the line of intersection between two surfaces. Highly sharpened edge is one where the two surfaces are highly polished to form a very fine edge. This represents a 60 or 80 grit edge, magnified a few hundred times, and this represents a 600 grit edge. When we have that 60 grit edge that you're going to see around here, it looks like saw teeth. The points of those saw teeth can be just as sharp as the edge that's done with 600 grit, but the problem is there's nothing to stabilize those points on the side because they look like saw teeth. So just a couple of hits into the wood and it breaks those teeth off. And when it breaks those teeth off, you've got blunt ends. And it's not very long till those blunt ends are rounded over and your tool's dull. Sharp and turning tools begins at 600 grit. If you're sharpening below that, more power to you, but you will know a difference when you first hit 600 grit, the first time you get it right. Neil S. is a guy from Australia. He's on the AAW forum, and he has been putting out a lot of really good information lately. And he states that the more refined edge, the longer the edge will last. According to him, a 300 grit edge will last, say, X. A 600 grit edge will last nearly 4 times that on the same piece of steel. Okay? So if you take a piece of high-speed steel like a Doug Thompson gouge and you sharpen it to 600 grit, it will last a whole lot longer. If you take a Sorby M2 sharpen it to 600 grit, and the Doug Thompson to sharpen it to 600 grit. The Sorby, the Doug Thompson steel will outlast the Sorby steel about 6 or 7 to 1 as far as keeping that edge sharp. An 80 grit friable rock or an 80 grit CBN edge is not sharp. It will cut immediately. As soon as those teeth break off, that edge is dull and you're back at the grinder. Now then, another big question that always comes up is, do you need to step through the grits for sharpening? Do we need to start shape it at 80, then go to 300, and then go to 400, and then go to 600? No. We're not painting and we're not cutting paint here. That 600 grit wheel will knock those 80 grit edges off just one pass, and they're gone. What's the difference between grinding and sharpening? I hear this a lot. I need to go grind my gouge. Grinding to me is when you're horsing on it, right? No. No way. Grinding is what you do when you're shaping your tool. Get it to the right shape, and then you shouldn't have to grind it anymore. Unless you're like me and you get careless, and then one day the cut's not doing what it's want to, and you look at the edge again and say, how did I mess that up? Sharpening is refining that edge with a very fine wheel. It's almost like honing, but honing the outside edge of a bowl gouge is pretty difficult to do. And learning to do that takes a lot of time. And once again, the finer the edge, the more we refine that edge, the longer it will stay sharp. When do you know it's time to resharpen? When the cutting surface begins to deteriorate. The cut surface begins to deteriorate. And we'll show that a little bit later on. I don't want to crank it up right now, but you will see there'll be a white fuzziness to this deal, and you put a sharp gouge right behind it, and it's just like you brighten the whole thing up when you're ready to make your finished cut. You should always sharpen your tool before you make your finished cut. Then you can rough out your next bowl and everything, and then when you get ready to, I promise you, when you start using sharp tools, this won't be a question. Will it? There will not be a question. You'll know when that tool's dull. But to know when a tool's dull, you've got to know what it means to have a sharp tool. High-speed steel. I've been told by a master machinist that back in the bygone years, back when my daddy used to work on those things, that the machinist used high carbon steel to cut mild steel. You can get steel so hard that you can't cut it with steel, so then you've got to grind it. That's your only other option. But high-speed steel was made to cut steel. Good steel, not just mild steel. High-speed steel will cut high-carbon steel. It's called high-speed steel because you can be cutting it on a metal lathe, and the chip that's coming off, the curl that's coming off, can be white hot, but the cutter will still cut. You can cut it till the cutter's blue, turn it till the cutter's so hot that it turns blue, and it will still cut. On high-speed, high-carbon steel, you turn that tip blue, and it loses its temper, and it no longer cuts. Okay? And that's true when you're sharpening high-carbon steel. Here is your percentages. High-speed steel, and everything that we're talking about here is high-speed steel. So Doug Thompson steel is high-speed steel. M1 is 85% molybdenum, 1.5% tungsten, and 1.15% vanadium. Vanadium is one of your magic ingredients in high-speed steel. It adds toughness to the steel, and it increases its wear resistance. What dulls an edge? It's when you wear the edge out. So the more vanadium you have in it, up to a point, vanadium is a carbide. The more vanadium you have in it, the harder and longer the edge will last. Too much vanadium and the steel gets so brittle that you drop it on the floor and it'll shatter. Okay? So there's a trade-off with that. Now remember, these steels were made to cut iron and to cut other steels. They weren't made to cut wood. M2, which is the most popular one, that's what everybody refers to as just high-speed steel, is 2.2% vanadium. M3 is, you get the vanadium is 3.75. M4 is a little bit more than that. One-way tools, their gouges are M4. M4 is very, very good steel. So if you get a chance to buy some of those that somebody's selling users of them, don't back up from them because they're not the very best, because they're very good. And while I'm at it, Sorby M2 is a good steel also. You have to sharpen it a little more often. But the M42, and I'm trying to think, cobalt. M42 uses cobalt as its wear ingredient. Okay? They got some vanadium in it, but it uses cobalt. Okay? And that's very astute. But M42, all things being equal, sharpened to the same grit, will not outlast CPN 10V or A11. Those are the same steel, the 10%. The CPN is crucible powdered metal. That is a process. It's not a type of steel. It's just a process that they go through. Okay. The CPM is 9.75% vanadium, and Doug Thompson used to make some 15% vanadium called CPN 15V, and he had too much trouble with them getting dropped and they'd shatter and stuff like that. Stuart Batty is trying now to bring the 15V back, and I may buy some of them, but it's not going to be till after I see how they work out, because I certainly don't want something that I drop on the floor breaks it, because I'm pretty good at dropping things. Right at the bottom, you have your comparative wear resistance between M2, which is the standard high-speed steel, and crucible powdered metal, 10% vanadium. That's your Doug Thompson steel. Forming an edge. When metal melts, it forms beads. When you melt solder, does it come out with a really sharp edge on it, or does it turn into a bead? Steel and iron does the same thing. To make an edge, the beads must be cut. What metal do we want to cut? If it's vanadium that we want to cut, we have to have a medium to cut that with. The hardest thing known to man is diamond. The second hardest thing is CBN. When you grind a Doug Thompson steel on a friable rock, the friable rock will not cut the vanadium. It eats around it. And now we're talking microscopic particles. It eats around it until it loosens it up enough and it tears that piece out. The only thing you have left on your edge is basically Fe. You know what Fe is? Iron. Plain old iron. So go down to the store and buy you a piece of angle iron and cut you a chunk off the side of it and sharpen it up, and you've got a bowl gouge. And it's way cheaper. But the edge won't last any time. CBN wheels, cubic boron nitride. One of the most asked questions is, do I need CBN wheels? If you look at the crucible particle metallurgy, they take the metal and they heat it up till it's molten. They put it into a special gun and they pump it through a nozzle that makes little bitty tiny particles. Okay, that's where we get the powdered metal or particle metal. Okay, then they get all the different combinations of the steels and additives. They mix it all together, and then they sinter it or press it together under high heat and high pressure and form it back into a rod. Basically, that's what the tools are, and then they grind the fluid in them. Okay? So if you look at this chart, you see highly magnified. The CPM steel is, see all the little tiny white dots? That's those etacarbides that's floating around in that steel. That's what's making it tough and wear. Look on the conventional steel. Look at how big those carbides and those little flakes of steel are in there and how they're spread out. It's very easy to find a soft spot in the steel. And so that's why you sharpen it. You go over the deal and it makes 2 or 3 turns and it doesn't cut anymore. That sometimes you have to go sharpen it 2 or 3 times before you get back into the good metal. Okay? So the crucible particle metal is a system. It is not a type of steel, okay? Life on the edge. Each tool has one edge, but each edge has 2 sides. It is important that both sides of the edge are refined. I'm going to pass a tool around for you. I sharpened this today on the bottom, and you can look at how pretty that bottom is. That's 600 grit sharpened on there. Don't look at the edge. It was all messed up before I did this. But feel the inside of this flute. And later on, we're going to turn with that, and I'm going to show you what it doesn't do. That's one thing, advantage that Sorby has over Doug Thompson. He polishes the flutes on his gouges. So you don't have to go in there and work on that at all. But even at that, the Doug Thompson steel will still outlast it. Okay? But if you get that Doug Thompson steel and you start working like we have on getting those flutes polished out, it's amazing how long that stuff will cut. Infamous quotes from the Sharpening Mafia. I will have my sharpening station at the ready as my first machine to start the day of turning. Then go to the lathe as a second machine to go to. This will be the opposite of how I always proceeded in the past. That's somebody that knows what a sharp tool is, that before didn't know what a sharp tool is. That's the importance of sharpening. Told me, said, thank you, you have rekindled the joy of turning. First time we had a play day together, we spent 7 hours at his grinder. We had a break for lunch. That's all we did for the first 7 hours when we were supposed to be turning wood and having fun, was sharpening. And another friend that he brought by bought a new bowl gouge, and every time he stuck it into the bowl, it caught and threw chunks and threw the bowl at him and ripped the gouge out of his hand and everything else. And he was literally terrified of that. But he turned it faster so it cut better. Yeah, he turned it backwards so it'd cut better. Faster, yeah. He turned his lathe up so that he could get it to cut better so it wouldn't catch as much. And his quote was, "You mean I no longer have to fear my Ellsworth? Your tools will not sharpen themselves. All the presentations that I do in the world will not sharpen your tools. Come to Open Shop and we will begin to teach you how to sharpen tools until you pick up the tools and learn how to sharpen them. That's the only way you're going to do it." Since there are no questions, no. Any questions?